Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Phil Hazler, Cabinet Member for Planning, Parking, Highways and Transport. Thank you for joining us this evening to start thinking about preparing the South West Maidenhead Development Framework Supplementary Planning Document, SPD for short, a document that will develop our placemaking aspirations for the South West Maidenhead area. This is the third event exploring the issues and helping us develop the thinking. Tonight we'll be focusing on the issue of sustainability and environment. We've already covered community needs and connectivity in previous sessions. The scope and location of South West Maidenhead development area provides an opportunity to help meet our borough's considerable housing and other needs in a coordinated, comprehensive and more sustainable way by delivering the right mix of homes, including much needed family and affordable housing. It also provides an opportunity to deliver high quality environment, maintaining a high quality of life, one that's well integrated into the existing community and benefits from the right balance of on-site community facilities and infrastructure. Together with new employment space, improved walking and connectivity and enhanced public access to open space that everyone can enjoy. This is preferable to the alternative of speculative and piecemeal developments well away from towns and villages within the Greenbelt that would put pressure on services and facilities in those communities. As with all development areas of any size, there is always a balance to strike within the practical constraints in order to meet local needs. The preparation of the borough local plan itself has involved careful and sometimes challenging decisions that balance needs and requirements, not least in relation to the South West Maidenhead area, bearing in mind the requirement to meet our considerable housing needs. The adopted borough local plan has set the vision to create a rounded, high quality place where people will want to live and enjoy living. My important message to everyone is that I would encourage you as we move on to the next stage in the planning process to please get involved in helping to inform not just the SPD for the area, but the planning application that will come forward to ensure that vision for a high quality place becomes a reality. After the upcoming presentation, there will be an opportunity to submit written questions via Teams for the planning officers to kindly answer during this event. After the event, please do submit your comments and feedback via the form on the council website so they can be fed into the SPD process. A link to the webpage will be placed in the chat. We welcome constructive engagement to ensure we fully capture and understand the key considerations in preparing the SPD. Please submit comments by the 27th of April this year. Now, we're aiming to conclude this session at 8:45 this evening. Any questions that are unanswered during the session will be posted on the council website. I'm now going to hand over to Ian Manctelo to set the scene for preparing the SPD. In fact, that might not be Ian Manctelo, it might be Ian Motchell. Apologies for that.
Thank you, Councillor Hassler. Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm Ian Motchell. I'm the Planning Policy Manager at the Royal Borough, and I'm going to be talking tonight, giving a scene setting presentation. So very shortly we'll pass over to the presentation, and I've got I'll be going through some slides. Some of you, here we go. So there are 3 sessions in total, and this is the third one on sustainability and environment as part of the process of preparing the placemaking SPD. So that's supplementary planning document. So some of you may have already heard this presentation a couple of times before now, so I may be slightly briefer than the previous presentations. So the purpose of the session really is to help develop our understanding of these issues and develop the placemaking aspirations in the Southwest Maidenhead SPD, and it's really a good opportunity to remind ourselves also about what the borough local plan says about the Southwest Maidenhead area and these sites as a starting point for preparing the SPD. And it's an opportunity for you to share what's most important to you, especially in relating to the three themes, and obviously tonight's theme is on sustainability and environment. So in terms of the format, I'll set the scene to explain what the SPD will cover and remind us about what the local plan says. So there will be a Q&A session, so please put your questions and comments in the chat bar as we go through it. So after there'll be after I've given this first presentation, we'll stop for questions and answers, and then after that we'll go on to the second presentation, which will be given by Ian Manctolo on sustainability and environment, and at the end, after that, there'll then be a second question and answer session, and then finally back to me for a couple of slides on the next step. So there is you can give feedback through the chat function, but also there is a response form that we've prepared, and that is online, and you can add further thoughts and comments, and also there is the deadline for submitting the response form is the 27th of April. So we have several officers on hand tonight to help answer questions, and if we can't answer them tonight, we'll provide answers online in due course, and we have actually today published some answers to questions from the first session, and the presentations and the recordings will also be made available online. So just in terms of the borough local plan then, so it was adopted in February this year, and it includes a whole range of policies and sets out how we'll deliver the housing and jobs that we need, protecting green areas, and how we will provide the supporting infrastructure over the next decade or so. So the plan period ends in 2033, and it sets the policies from which more detailed SPDs will be prepared, and is a key factor in determining planning applications. Now you may have heard that about a legal challenge to the BLP. So after the local plan is adopted, there is a 6-week period for persons aggrieved by the plan to make an application to the High Court, and the council has been notified that a legal claim has been lodged with the court, but I think it's important to emphasise that the local plan continues to have full weight in the planning process, and it doesn't affect the work that we're undertaking on the SPD. And because there are legal proceedings, we cannot comment any more this evening on that. So why are we producing a framework SPD? Well, the local plan itself provides a lot of detail, but the SPD will add to that and sets out a comprehensive approach to development. And it's really important to emphasise that it will ensure the timely and coordinated delivery of new infrastructure that's needed, and it also will provide more detail to guide the planning applications, including on design, and also will have an illustrative master plan. However, it's not going to cover absolutely everything. There will be more detail at the planning application stage. And the SPD doesn't provide new policy, it supplements existing policy in the BLP. It doesn't replace the BLP either. So where does this stage fit within the overall process? So preparing an SPD is the next part of the planning process. The borough local plan sets the policy, sets the key requirements for the sites and also the borough overall. And the SPD, Supplementary Planning Document, provides more detail to guide its delivery and includes the illustrative master plan. And then, so the SPD itself informs planning applications for the site, which will cover detailed design, layout, quality and quantity of development and so on. But in terms of engagement, the SPD is part of an ongoing process of engagement and consultation. So this started with the borough local plan, and that included a placemaking study that was in itself consulted on. And then you have the early engagement that we're undertaking now. And then there will be further consultation on the draft SPD later in the year, in the summer, when we publish a draft version for formal consultation. But there will be further consultation when the planning applications start to come in. So developers often undertake pre-application engagement, and then there's again consultation on the planning applications themselves, and it's likely that there'll be more than one planning application given the multiple developers and landowners on the site. This slide really shows the area that the SPD will cover. So to the north you have the town centre and the railway station. To the south you have the M4 motorway, and it's really the area in between those two transport lines. So to the northeast you've got Braywick Park, and to the southwest there's Ockwells Park. And the AL13 is really the housing site, and that includes the golf course area and the land south of Harvest Hill Road, and that AL13 will include the schools as well, and through the middle you've got Harvest Hill Road. The AL14 is the triangle employment site for industrial and warehousing development. And that's separated from AL13 by the A308M. And then Braywick Park AL15 is allocated in the BLP for green infrastructure and leisure facilities, etc. And most of the development, the focus will be on the two allocated sites, main allocated sites, AL13 and AL14, but wider connections to the green sites are critical as well. But the local plan itself, the BLP, identifies a placemaking area that goes wider than the main development sites, and that's the area of the red line. So quite a lot of work's already been undertaken as part of the BLP to understand the sites and the areas, and that's the starting point. And the placemaking study in 2019 helped to inform and shape the policy in the borough local plan, but is also relevant for preparing the SPD. This included looking at the constraints in the area, including flood risk and historic environment and so on. And there was some engagement at the time with stakeholders, and a range of issues were highlighted, and some of those are on the screen now. I won't read through all of those. And these reports are all available on the website. So what does the local plan say about the placemaking area? Well, first of all, it contains a high-level vision for the placemaking area, and then there's also a policy QP1B, which includes a series of key principles and requirements. And I won't go through all of these now, but I think some of the ones to sort of really highlight are the need for comprehensive and coordinated development, and connectivity, and also infrastructure delivery, including green infrastructure and biodiversity and high quality development. It's getting the right infrastructure at the right time, and the SPD will assist in this process. So just in terms of a little bit more about the sites themselves and the pro formas. So the AL13 pro forma. So this is for 2,600 homes, and on 90 hectares, which is around about 225 acres in old money. And there's a long list of requirements in the pro forma, around about 30 in total. And they are largely divided in between the three themes that we've had for these sessions. So there'll be two distinct neighbourhoods, a local centre with some shops and other facilities, primary and secondary school, and affordable housing, self-build housing, and so on. There's also enhanced access to and within the site, public transport, and green infrastructure as well, including all aspects of transportation. And that was the focus of the second session. And obviously green infrastructure is about a third session tonight. And the role of the SPD is to provide more detail on how these will all be delivered. Moving on to AL14 and AL15. So AL14 is the triangle site, industrial and warehousing. So that's 26 hectares, but not all of it will be developed due to a number of constraints, in particular flooding, and that will limit the extent of development. AL15 is Braywick Park, and that's a green infrastructure area. But again, I think connectivity to and from the site is very important. So that was really just a quick run through the context and scene setting. And now I'd just like to hand over now to Ian Gillespie, who has been looking at questions in the chat bar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Not too many questions have come through. Apologies again to those that are having difficulties with the sound this evening. We have checked things at our end, and I think the sound is going out okay. But as I say, I'm really sorry if you are having difficulties, and hopefully the recording will be clearer for you if you want to watch it again at another time. So in terms of questions about the sort of subject and the content, who will be responsible for the border with Crescent Dale? Will the trees stay and be maintained, as at the moment they are not, and we have fly tipping? So Crescent Dale is at the northern end of the golf course site, and the SPD process itself, I suspect, won't get into the level of detail at looking as to how we can design out areas that may attract antisocial behaviour, including fly tipping, or it won't get into the detail of looking at individual trees, but it may well include principles such as maintaining boundary trees wherever possible, and equally it will include some principles around designing out areas that may be subject to antisocial behaviour, as I say, such as fly tipping. I suspect the stage at which you will probably get the detailed answer to that question will be at the planning application stage, when the precise layout of the development will be determined, but it will be Carla Holmes working with the property company that will be responsible for that boundary with Crescent Dale. And then we have a question or a statement around asking us not to say that we are protecting green areas, and that is misleading as a result of the amount of greenbelt land that will be developed as a result of the adopted local plan. Ian Motchell, are you able to provide a response to that question, please?
It's happened again. I was just researching one of the other questions and I wasn't listening fully to you. Sorry, could you just say that again?
Sorry, there's a statement, Ian, around the fact that the local plan isn't protecting green areas. That's felt to be misleading because the BLP will result in the development of 200 acres of green belts. And just asking whether you can respond to that point, please.
Certainly. I mean, inevitably, when you are developing a site for housing and employment and other uses, there inevitably will be a loss of some green space. Clearly, can't get away from that. However, what we're trying to do is mitigate that and minimise that through providing areas of green space, the green spine, biodiversity areas, you know, throughout the site as far as we can, while still meeting the amounts of development that are set out in the plan. So yes, we can't obviously protect all of the existing open space, so there will inevitably be some loss, but we're doing everything we can to minimise that and to mitigate and compensate for that.
Thank you, Ian. And then we've got a couple of points around the mapping. So the first question is, why isn't the ancient woodland at Rushington Copse clearly labelled on the map? And then a second question around, what does the red box represent in the AL15 map? Ian Manktelow, are you able to respond on those two questions?
I'll certainly come back on the first question about Rushington Copse. And I suppose my comment there is, when we prepare and publish the draft supplementary planning document, clearly showing the relevant constraints affecting the site and the wider area is going to be really important. And indeed, part of what the SPD will include is effectively an illustrative master plan. So that would show areas like Rushington Copse and how Rushington Copse connects to, I suppose, other green areas that are proposed as part of a kind of green infrastructure network. So if it's not shown on existing plans in terms of what we prepare and produce for the SPD, it's a really important point that you made, that it's quite clear that it's shown there in those more detailed sort of illustrative diagrams that will go into the SPD. On the second question, I haven't had a chance to check it out. I don't know whether that was one that Ian Motchell was checking out.
Ian Motchell, yeah, I think
I could guess, but I think Ian probably has the definitive answer. But
yes, thank you, Ian. I can confirm that it's a site of special scientific interest, is what the red box on the Braywick Park allocation denotes.
Thank you, Ian. And then we have a couple of questions from Wild Maidenhead. The first one around whether the development will be wildlife friendly, including hedgehog highways, bat and bird boxes, wildflower planting and native species hedgerows. And it's picked up that those matters are covered in the local plan policy NR2. And it's also asked that on such a large site, there should be space for on-site biodiversity net gain in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy. Ian Manktelow, do you want to have a go at answering that one on biodiversity net gain? I think really.
Yeah, I'll perhaps give a brief answer now, but I'll come back to this when I kind of do the presentation for the sort of second half of this session. But clearly one of the important principles that is set out in the local plan is both about securing biodiversity net gain across the area as a whole, and in particular in relation to the sites, but also within the development sites, ensuring that there is good, what you might call green connectivity or good green infrastructure framework, through which not just people can move in terms of sort of some of the connectivity issues that we talked about in the session last week, but also in terms of wildlife networks as well, and the ability for wildlife to move through the development. So the level of detail that will go into the SPD, we perhaps need to work through, but certainly we'd be expecting those sorts of measures that are suggested in the chat there to be incorporated by the developers as they bring forward their more detailed planning applications and more detailed schemes. I'll say more about net gain when I get onto the presentation.
Thank you, Ian. And then a second question from Wild Maidenhead regarding the loss of trees, in particular mature trees on the site, and how is that compatible with some of the BLP policies on biodiversity, trees and woodland and hedgerows, and then some quite specific questions around the percentage of trees that will be, I think that's supposed to be protected, and how will they be protected, whether there will be use of tree preservation orders, and the types of trees that will be planted as replacements. I can have a go at answering some of those questions. We haven't got all the detail here this evening. I said at one of the previous sessions that to accommodate the scale of development that is proposed at Southwest Maidenhead, there will need to be a large number of trees removed, but we will be looking to encourage the retention of the more mature and grade category A trees on the site. I think we will also be looking at the boundary trees in particular, because they will provide some edge treatment between the proposed new development and existing surrounding development. And in terms of the types of trees that will be planted as replacements, I mean, that is a point of detail. There may be some guidance in the SPD on that, but that will really come through the planning application process, with specialist input from our arboriculturalists and landscape consultants. And then we've got a question around AL14 and concerns in relation to flooding on that site, and what mitigation measures will be put in place to alleviate flooding that won't have a detrimental impact on water levels upstream in the Cut and the Bourne rivers. And the concern there is, I think, whether that might result in any additional flooding in Hollyport village, particularly taking into account the additional risks of flooding as a result of climate change. Ian Motchell, do you want to respond to that question, please?
I should concentrate more because I was looking again. I was just looking at some questions that I was just going to start answering in the chat room, and I've done it again. I'm afraid. Sorry.
It's all right. It's all right. It's a flooding question, Ian. So I thought that was your area, and concerns around flooding on the AL14 triangle site.
Yeah.
And how can we ensure that the mitigation measures that are put in place won't result in a detrimental impact on water levels upstream, and won't increase the risk of flooding in Hollyport village?
Sure. Okay, well, there are a number of requirements in the pro forma for AL14 that will including a lot more work from the developers in terms of a site-specific flood risk assessment at the planning application stage, and that will include ensuring that that there won't be any negative flooding implications for areas both on the site but also off the site as well, including obviously in those sort of Hollyport Bray type of areas. So there'll be a consultation with the Environment Agency, and the developers will have to demonstrate very robustly that they can manage flood risk in a safe way, so that you know, it genuinely isn't going to cause problems for communities on other sites.
Thank you, Ian. There's then a question around has there been an estimate of how many trees will be lost from the planned development? I'm afraid I haven't got a figure that I can provide. The actual number of trees that will need to be removed to accommodate the development will only be known once the detail planning layout has been prepared, submitted and determined as a planning application. It's too early to provide any guesstimate at this stage. Question from Wild Maidenhead in relation to wildlife corridors around the perimeter of the site to allow for the movement of protected species and I guess wildlife in general. That's certainly something that we've already been having a look at. There is certainly going to be a strong green corridor running down through the site. The green spine that is set out as a principle in the local plan. That'll be running north-south as a sustainable movement corridor, but also as a wildlife corridor. I've mentioned already the importance of retaining some of the or as much as we can of the planting around the edges of the site. That's partly around providing a bit of a buffer between new development and existing development, but that will also assist with the movement of wildlife. And it's likely that there will be a strong green corridor running along the southern part of the residential development south of Harvest Hill Road again, which should provide a good movement corridor for wildlife. Then we've got have you done a tree survey to know how many mature trees will be lost? There are over 1,000 mature trees, not including Rushington copse. How will you deliver a 10% biodiversity gain when you are destroying so much habitat? As I said, we haven't got a figure at the moment to confirm the number of trees that will be lost as a result of the development. There has been some tree survey work undertaken previously by the council, and there is some tree survey work that is being undertaken or has been undertaken by some of the developers and landowners within the southwest Maidenhead area. So we are aware of what is on the site, but clearly we need to work up a scheme before we can come to a view in terms of the number of trees that can be retained within the site. And on biodiversity gain, Ian Manctillo, I think you'll be covering that in your presentation, but if there are any further questions that arise, we can pick those up after your presentation.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then a further question: as the site extends down towards the M4 motorway, or also on the south side of the motorway, large parts of the site are subject to flooding, currently form part of the blue infrastructure of the area and also provide a wildlife corridor. This is quite a long question here. In May 2018, the area that floods in the triangle south of the A310 was proposed to the council as a new local wildlife site. Will this flood area be a local wildlife site in the future, or has that now been quashed completely? I don't know whether Jason or James have got any updates on the position with the proposals for a local wildlife site.
I don't. I assume we would have to be led by what's in the borough local plan and what the area has been allocated to be. So I think that would have to be the lead there.
Thank you, James. But it's not allocated as a local wildlife site in the local plan. But any habitats worthy of protection will need to be picked up at the planning application stage as well, with detailed ecology surveys to support those applications. And certainly on the Triangle site, as Ian Motchell has already mentioned, quite a large part of that area is liable to flooding, and for that reason is unlikely to be developed in any event. And the precise areas for development within that area will only be known once the more detailed flood risk assessment work has been completed by the applicant at the planning application stage. Then we have a comment about why don't we just build on the existing fairways. That's a simple response on that, really. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to accommodate the scale of planned development at Southwest Maidenhead if we restricted the built area just to the fairways on the golf course. We've gone beyond that with the adopted local plan now, but if we had have taken that approach, the consequence would have been that we would have needed to identify additional areas for development, because if the capacity of Southwest Maidenhead was significantly lower, additional areas of greenbelt land would have needed to have been identified to accommodate the overall housing need within the borough. Then got a question on TPOs. We were told TPOs were not required as the council owned the land. How will the council ensure that mature trees are protected? As I've outlined already, it will be the case. Unfortunately, a number of trees are going to have to be removed to accommodate the development, but we would certainly be looking to retain, wherever possible, those specimens. There are a number of fine oaks, I know, on the golf course land, to provide a mature landscape setting for the development, and equally looking to retain as many of those boundary trees as we can to provide that separation between existing and planned development. Then there's a question around, is it predetermined that the developer will be Carla Homes? So Carla Homes are the joint venture partner with the property company. So Carla Homes will be developing the golf course land, so the land north of Harvest Hill Road. But there are other developers and landowners on the land south of Harvest Hill Road, and Carla won't be building those properties. We've then got a question around what are going to happen to the wild deer on the golf course. James or Jason, one would assume as the development takes place, they will naturally migrate away from the built areas, but I don't know whether you've got a comment on that.
I think a lot will depend on the corridors and that central spine, that sustainability transport spine. You know, the deer would then be able to move across the site, but again, that's a detail to be seen once we've got a more detailed plan. But yeah, if there are boundary treatments, you know, then or vegetation left, then hopefully they can provide a corridor.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. We are going to have to move on to the second presentation, but I can come back to some of these questions after that presentation. Perhaps just one more in terms of the scale of development and whether the 2,600 homes on AL13 is a minimum or a maximum target. It's an approximate figure, so it's not a minimum, it's not a maximum, it's an approximate figure that we will be looking at through the SPD process, and again, it ultimately, the eventual scale of development on the site will be determined at the planning application stage, but taking into account all of the requirements, pro forma requirements set out in the local plan, as well as the content and the principles set out in the SPD that we're working on at the moment. So I'll make a note of where we've got to, come back to the questions that we haven't managed to get to so far after we have Ian Manktelow's presentation. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I will just put up my presentation now so we can just run through the slides on the topic of sustainability and environment. And we've obviously already started to touch on a number of issues in this sort of area anyway. So just to introduce myself, those who've not heard me in the last couple of sessions, I'm the Principal Planning Officer in the Planning Policy team, and obviously working on the South West Maidenhead SPD work. So I'm conscious both in this session this evening already and I think particularly in the first session we did, there've been quite a lot of questions around and comments and concerns around environmental issues. So that's appropriate to spend a bit more time just going through some of those issues. We've already started to answer or answer some of the questions or cover some of the material I was going to cover, but I'll run through this and it may help just to put things a little bit more in sort of wider context. So I'll start just by touching on what we mean by sustainable development and how that sort of, I suppose, gets expressed and considered in the planning process. Talk a little bit about green infrastructure and biodiversity, including biodiversity net gain. Talk a little bit about trees, but I think we've already kind of explored that quite a bit, and there may be some more questions to explore on that as when we get back to the Q&A. And then talk a little bit about, I suppose, sustainable building and the whole sort of carbon net zero carbon issue as well, and climate change, and then just touch on at the end about sort of some of the other environmental factors that need to be considered when both preparing an SPD, but also when the planning applications come forward on individual parts of the South West Maidenhead area. So in terms of what do we mean by sustainable development, I suspect we probably potentially could all come up with different sort of definitions, and I don't claim to be an expert and have the definitive definition, but I suppose that there's two things really that I suppose are in my mind in terms of what we mean by sustainable development. One is about considering the impact of what we do now on the future, and then linked to that really is about balancing socio-economic and environmental factors in making those decisions about the future, and hence the sort of overlapping circles there that consideration of sustainable development clearly does include environmental issues strongly, but we have to take account of the social and economic needs of society as well. And I mentioned that really because of how sustainable development is really considered through the planning process. And Ian Mottram in his kind of scene setting explained about really the three different stages of the planning process that we go through, and the fact that we've already been through the local plan. Then there is this SPD work, and then we get to the more detailed planning applications that really show in detail what's going to happen on the ground. And the consideration of the environment and sustainable development is kind of factored in at each of those stages. So with the local plan, there was what's called a sustainability appraisal that was undertaken to inform the decisions that were made on the plan. It's a very detailed and lengthy piece of work, several volumes at various stages in the process of preparing the plan. And that basically assesses individual sites, the overall plan strategy, the policies in the plan against a range of economic, environmental and social sort of factors or criteria. And that has been the basis of how then we make decisions alongside the more detailed evidence in determining which sites get allocated in the overall approach of the plan. At this stage, in terms of preparing an SPD, we're going to be following up that work a little bit with what's called a strategic environmental assessment. So it's still, as the name implies, strategic. It's still quite high level, but to some extent it will go back and look at some of those environmental factors that were considered through the local plan appraisal and just see how those perhaps moved on in the light of the work that we're doing on the SPD and any further evidence that we gathered during this process. But then when you get to the planning application stage, you then get another level of detail of environmental information. Now, for perhaps very large applications, planning applications, there's something called an environmental impact assessment that would be prepared. But even if they're not such major applications, then those applications still need to be supported by the right sort of environmental information to help us to assess that application against the policies in the local plan in particular. So that will provide a greater level of detail on the, I suppose, the environmental impact of those detailed planning applications when they come forward. So just moving on to thinking about green infrastructure, and when Ian Motchell sort of set the scene, he showed you a slide of some of those key principles that are set out in the local plan, in the kind of placemaking policy for South West Maidenhead, and one of those was about providing a strategic green infrastructure framework and a network of green spaces to meet strategic and local requirements, and that includes new open space, including new public open space, and that is a key principle that needs to underpin the proposals that come forward for this area. So and that is all about providing green connectivity, and not just connectivity for movement of people, but connectivity, as we touched on in the questions, for movement of wildlife and to support biodiversity. But also those areas will provide important areas for kind of recreation and leisure, including publicly accessible open space, and that strategic requirement in the plan refers to meeting our local standards for open space provision. And if you delve into the back of the local plan, there's an appendix there that actually sets out in quite some detail those sort of standards and guidelines for what we'd expect to be provided on sites in terms of the different types of open space you'd expect in a development. So those standards include identifying a range of different open spaces that should be provided, the amount of those different types of open spaces, and also how accessible those open spaces should be to people living in a new development. So what would the walk distance be to get to a particular type of open space, and the guidelines around the quality that we would expect as well. So those guidelines and some of the detail in the pro formas on the sites in the local plan give us an important sort of starting point from which the more detailed proposals for the green infrastructure and open space framework and network can be sort of created. And as the slide implies at the bottom there, just the opportunities here for food production as well. So, for instance, provision of allotments can be built into and factored into that sort of green infrastructure network as well. And I won't go into detail because we mentioned this last week, and I think probably already this evening, but clearly the importance of that north-south connecting green spine is very important. It's highlighted strongly in the pro forma in the local plan, and it's the connection to that sort of southern fringe or green sort of margin to the housing site, kind of in proximity to where it starts to get close to the motorways, is going to be really important, both from that general connectivity point of view, a recreation point of view, but also in particular a biodiversity and wildlife point of view as well, to have that connectivity and have that green fringe that will support wildlife and biodiversity. So coming on to the question of biodiversity net gain, and this has obviously come up this evening already. I know it came up a little bit in the first session. The local plan sets an objective or a principle that there should be biodiversity net gain across the site and across the adjoining sort of placemaking area. But it's actually not just the local plan now. The Environment Act from last year is bringing in a requirement for 10% biodiversity net gain overall in frankly in most new developments, and that links through as well to the sort of material that's in our environment and climate change strategy as well. The thing about biodiversity net gain, I guess critically, is that it is a measurable approach. And the government have published tools to assist developers in undertaking that measurement, and for that matter, for us as an authority to assess what those developers say is their level of biodiversity they're providing on sites. But in a nutshell, those tools enable a developer to work out what their current biodiversity value is on their site before development happens, but also to then estimate or predict what the level of biodiversity would be on the site when they bring forward their scheme. Yeah, there are detailed tools then available for them to do that. And that really then takes on to what do you do with that information, and how does that kind of influence how a scheme is brought forward. And the critical thing, and this is set out both in the local plan and again at a national level, is to apply what's called the hierarchy or the mitigation hierarchy approach to how we address the issue of net gain. So the first principle being, wherever possible, to avoid any impact on biodiversity, or if you can't do that, to minimise that impact. And only once you kind of consider that to mitigate, and to mitigate ideally on the site where the development is being proposed. And only if you can't secure the net gain through those measures do you compensate by, for instance, making some sort of contribution to improving the biodiversity of land nearby but off the site. So in terms of Southwest Maidenhead, that involves clearly avoiding and minimising impact where we can, but I think, as we've already discussed, there will be some impacts. Some impacts will not be avoidable due to the level of development we need to provide for, but there is scope to mitigate through planting schemes, through the creation of that green infrastructure network that I talked about, through that southern fringe to the AL13 site, through some of the areas that can't be developed on the Triangle site as well. So there's quite a lot of scope there for mitigation. That should be the priority and the starting point for trying to get as close as possible to net gain. I think only if that can't get us all the way there, then we need to look further afield, either within the placemaking area or potentially nearby outside the placemaking area, to deliver that overall net gain. But the bottom line is that net gain will need to be delivered in biodiversity terms. So we've talked a lot about trees already, and this just, I suppose, outlines some of the basic requirements in the policy and in the pro forma in relation to trees, particularly in relation to the housing site. So as Ian Gillespie suggested, then clearly we need to assess the quality of the trees on the site and identify those that are particularly high quality specimens to, wherever possible, try and retain those. Quite specifically, the policy says retain Washington copse and retain other mature trees and hedgerows wherever possible. And again, in answer to some of the questions tonight, then we will be looking to retain and reinforce those landscape buffers around the edge of the site. As part of the construction process, it's important that the trees that we want to retain, we want to ensure that they are protected from the impact of construction. So the policy talks about that. And yes, we recognise there will be loss of trees, but we also expect to see new tree planting as part of securing that overall improvement that we talked about. And I think it's just worth saying, Jason and James, who are on the call today, heavily involved in new tree planting schemes, a lot of experience within the council in terms of bringing forward tree planting initiatives, and Ockwells Park nearby is a good example of that. Moving on to climate change, and I'm sure many of you will be aware that the council approved an environment and climate change strategy, which you can see in detail on the website. It sets out 4 sort of strategic themes and a more detailed action plan to help, I suppose, deliver those themes or objectives. Themes around what's called the circular economy and more sustainable use of resources, encouraging recycling. A theme around energy, that's partly about reducing energy consumption, decarbonising our supply, but also renewable energy generation as well. Natural environment, which includes the whole biodiversity issue and greening sort of initiatives. And then transport and reducing the need for carbon intensive travels, ensuring that we secure sustainable travel. The digital infrastructure, really important around that, and obviously zero carbon infrastructure as well. And also we touched on some of those transport issues in the session last week, if you joined in on that session. So coming down a sort of level in terms of the framework that we have to address climate change, the local plan has a specific climate change policy, which talks about the sorts of measures that development need to be bringing forward to mitigate climate change. So that can be around building design, how you orientate buildings, about ventilation, about things like introducing green roofs and the like. For green and blue infrastructure, and I think there was a question there about, we had a comment earlier about native species. Yes, you know, to try and optimise the level of planting in terms of native species wherever we can, and tree planting generally as being a good thing in terms of mitigating against climate change, both from a carbon point of view, but also with greater heat and providing shade as well. Sustainable drainage systems, really important in terms of the question we had earlier about flooding and managing flood risk, ensuring we've got genuinely sustainable solutions to drainage. And that there is intention to produce more detailed guidance on this, although the borough-wide design guide that's already published a couple of years ago does provide a little bit more guidance on I suppose building design in relation to climate change. Overall, again, one of the principles that are set out for the overall policy for South West Maidenhead is to ensure that there are measures to reduce climate change and environmental impacts, including approaches to sustainable energy, recycling and construction. Finally, in terms of I suppose the framework, if you like, within which to look at the whole issue of sustainable building and carbon reduction, last year the council published what's called an interim sustainability position statement. So this is there to provide, again, more detailed guidelines and requirements for developers. It particularly focuses in on, I suppose let's call it the carbon issue really, and it sets out an energy hierarchy. You can see that set out there in the slide about being lean, so using less energy, clean in terms of supplying energy efficiently, and green, using renewable energy. And basically the requirement set out in that interim policy is to aim to achieve net zero carbon unless it's not feasible. And if it's not feasible, then to look at contributions to a carbon offset fund that will then be used to deliver projects that assist with carbon reduction. An really important part of that process and working through with developers is that they would submit energy assessments to, I suppose, demonstrate how they are reducing their carbon impact and ultimately working towards a net zero position in their developments. And clearly there are a range of potential options and interventions that they can introduce to work towards that, both in terms of renewables, EV charging points for cars and that sort of thing. It also touches on the issue of water efficiency standards as well. That's obviously another important consideration in an area of sort of water pressure or stress. So, of course, we touched on perhaps just 2 or 3 topics really in this presentation. There are a lot of other considerations that need to go into the mix really in terms of particularly bringing forward more detailed schemes for the development of the area. We touched on flood risk, and the Triangle site in particular is going to need that detailed flood risk assessment, but other sites too, potentially, to make sure that there is no risk from flooding, even and taking account of potential changes in climate change impacts. That needs to be built into those assessments. I know there's been questions before about kind of air and noise pollution and how we mitigate against that. Clearly, part of that is about the overall way that the development is, I suppose, made more sustainable from a transportation point of view. So the walking, cycling, public transport connectivity that we talked about last week, facilitating that with the right infrastructure, such as electric charging points as well. But it's also about looking at particularly those parts of the potential development areas that are close to polluting sources like main roads and motorways, and ensuring that the right mitigation is provided there, and if necessary, the right sort of buffers as well. There are historic environment considerations, such as the Scheduled Ancient Monument, which is on the setting of that's on the Triangle site, and clearly, obviously, the landscape issues and the longer sort of visibility of the site and how you deal with that, particularly in terms of landscaping schemes and so on. So quite a lot of that detail will come through at the planning application stage, but there may be some principles and some guidance there for the SPD to pick up on as well. And overall, I suppose that just ensuring that we've got the good understanding of the environmental constraints that apply. There's a lot of that that's come through from work on the local plan, work on the placemaking work that Highest did as part of the local plan a few years ago, but actually preparing the SPD and consulting on it as well may just flush out some other issues, and we'd obviously welcome any feedback on those issues both tonight and as we go through the process. So maybe just a few questions for you to think about both tonight, but in terms of also just putting any additional comments in through the form that Ian Motchell talked about on the website. So, do you agree with the approach to biodiversity net gain in the placemaking area and how we should approach that? What measures do you think will be most effective in tackling climate change? So there may be particular ways that you think would be helpful for us to consider and to also share with those bringing forward the detailed developments. And can you suggest any good examples of sustainable building elsewhere that we should perhaps look at? And just any other environmental factors or constraints you think we should be thinking about that we've not talked about tonight or not talked about in the chat over the last 2 or 3 sessions. At this point, I'll stop again and we'll go back to Ian Gillespie to just look at the final, the next set of questions in the chat bar.
Thank you, Ian. We've had quite a few questions during your presentation, so we'll do our best to get through as many of those as we can. But as has already been said, if we don't manage to get to all of these questions this evening, or we haven't got an answer for you tonight, we will put together some written responses, and those will be published online. I think just before going to the questions, it probably is worthwhile re-emphasising that at this stage in the SPD process, we're still in the sort of information gathering stage, and what we're really hoping to get out of these engagement sessions is are there any issues that we haven't thought about at this stage, or any principles that we could look to include within the SPD, and there seems to be some sort of questioning of whether we're being clear enough in our responses and guaranteeing things and promising things. We're not at that stage in the process at the moment. Very keen to hear your views. We'll do our best to answer your questions, but we're at a fairly early stage in the SPD process, and we should have more clarity as we work our way through the process. So picking up on the questions again, then the first one is, will there be a single planning permission coming from Carla Homes for the entire site? So just to be clear again, Carla Homes' interest is only in the golf course land, so the land north of Harvest Hill Road, and it will be up to them to determine whether they submit a single planning application for the whole of the site. It's very unlikely that they would put in a detailed planning application for the whole of the site. It may be an outline planning application that comes in first for the whole site, sort of getting the principles agreed before they come in with reserved matters applications. Or there's a possibility of a hybrid application whereby there would be an outline for the whole of the site, but they would provide the detail for the first phase or the first couple of phases of development, so that they could proceed with construction once that planning permission was granted. But that's for them to determine what their planning application strategy is. And we've been referred back to the 2016 Edge of Settlement assessment, and that runs through some of the priority. Oh, sorry, I'm just pausing here, reading some messages. There seems to be a bit of an issue with the video at the moment. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. So taking us back to the 2016 Edge of Settlement assessment, looking at references in there to priority species, protected species, and the probability of badgers, roosting and foraging bats, and various other flora and fauna that would need to be considered. And the suggestion that that's being disregarded through the inclusion of this site in the BLP, and what measures are in place to guarantee that there's no net loss of biodiversity. Well, I think it's fair to say that these issues haven't been disregarded by the site being included in the BLP. There are pro forma requirements requiring protection of various elements within the site, and as Ian Manxlow has explained, there is a requirement for a net gain in biodiversity overall, and a short to be enacted the Environment Act requirement in just over a year or so, that there needs to be a 10% net gain in biodiversity. And then some further questioning about why I think we're not doing more to use brownfield land in place of greenbelt development. And I saw later on in the chat a question bar around why aren't we making better use of vacant properties within the Royal Borough. Ian Motshaw, I don't know whether you want to say something about the approach in the local plan to making best use of brownfield land and other opportunities before we looked at using greenbelt land.
Certainly. Well, we've done everything we can to maximise the use of brownfield, previously developed land. That's always the first thing that you look at, but there just simply isn't enough brownfield land that's lying around unused, if you like, to meet our housing needs. So whilst theoretically you could use employment sites, the fact is that those employment sites, most of them are needed and are a part of the overall sustainability. So we took a decision to protect employment sites that are being actively used. So and the inspector in the local plan acknowledged that it wouldn't be possible to meet all of our housing and employment needs using brownfield land, and therefore inevitably there has been a need to use some greenfield and greenbelt land, although we've tried to minimise that as far as we can. And I think it's quite a well-known quote now that we are saying that we are using 1% of the green belt land to meet these needs, but we're protecting strongly the remaining 82%. So yes, we'd love to be able to say we can protect every put all of our housing needs on brownfield land, but that's just not possible.
Thank you, Ian. Then got a question around the BLP and the work that's been done in terms of the number of new homes that might be accommodated on the site, and the financial viability of that development. Well, the evidence base for the local plan certainly included a viability assessment of the proposals in the local plan, and that was considered by the independent inspector. And in terms of the deliverable number of new homes, as I said earlier, that the 2,600 dwellings figure is presented as an approximate number, and the actual number that will be delivered, maybe a bit of further sort of guidance through the SPD process, but ultimately the number of units will be determined at the planning application stage. And another query about biodiversity net gain, which I think we've already commented upon. And then a question around whether we will be requiring the houses to be sustainable in terms of energy production, solar panels and ground source heat pumps. Ian Manctelo, is that something you can comment upon?
Yes, thank you. I suppose as I explained in the presentation, what we have at the moment is the interim policy statement on sustainability, which is looking to secure development as net zero if possible, or if necessary offset to get to a point of net zero overall. So that there are different ways of doing that, and that's why the policy refers to undertaking energy assessments that show overall how developers can achieve that. So we will certainly be highlighting that through the SPD process. Clearly one solution is through solar panels and ground source heat pumps. I think the other thing to perhaps mention longer term is that although we have that policy, and we'll certainly be highlighting that policy as part of the SPD and as part of any sort of discussions with developers when they come forward with our schemes. Over time, we expect that the government to bring forward, I suppose, higher standards in terms of sustainable building anyway. There's something called the Future Home Standard that will be coming in the next few years, and that may well come through, for instance, through the building regulations. We would effectively that will then be the main mechanism to secure that sort of net zero approach rather than kind of interim planning policy type approaches. So I think over time we'll see that just coming in as absolutely standard through national policy and legislation. I don't know whether James got anything to add on that in terms of the direction of travel with the whole sort of net zero approach.
Not especially, Ian, but I think it's worth highlighting, you know, the success we've already had with some of the existing developments and that position statement. So we are seeing current developments that are coming forward in the borough, either net zero or making a contribution to the carbon offsetting fund. So we are seeing and do have a track record of securing low carbon developments in the borough already. So we would see a very similar approach, you know, going forward on the site.
Thank you, James. Come back to this question on what the red box represents on, it was meant to say the AL14 site. Just looking across our panel here, Ian Motchell, have you got an answer to that one now, please?
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I did check on that earlier, and it's a conservation area. It's it's like an orange line, I think, rather than red. And yes, definitely conservation area.
Thank you, Ian. And then another question around biodiversity net gain, which I think we've responded to, and then a question in relation to net zero homes and whether RBWM as the landowner and client can demand net zero homes. Don't know whether anyone wants to pick that one up. Anyone? No, not sure about a response on that one at the moment. I mean, as I mentioned previously, the RBWM or the property company and Carla's interest in the site is in relation to the golf course, so it's not something that can be demanded across the whole of the southwest Maidenhead area, but it's certainly something that we can take away and discuss with members and senior officers in terms of the strategy for delivering net zero homes, or certainly moving towards net zero homes. And I think, as Ian Manxlow has said earlier, we are slowly seeing the sort of requirements ratcheting up through building regulations, and the requirements becoming more onerous over time. So there may even be a point where it's not something that RBWM as landowner would choose to do, or they may choose to do anyway, but it may indeed be a requirement, depending upon when planning applications come in and are determined. And then a point around Rushington Copse being destroyed as an ancient woodland if it's part of the green and blue infrastructure, and that's something that's very much under consideration, I suppose, as part of the SPD process, that there is a definite tension there between protecting the ancient woodland and having it as a recreation resource, and that's something that we will certainly be considering further through the SPD process. There's a question then around council members declaring any conflict of interest. That's not something that officers are able to respond to this evening, but it's certainly something that we can pick up in our written response. And then a question around the number of vacant properties, which we've already addressed, and come back again on the sort of the amount of green belt that's being lost, how much of Maidenhead's green belt. I think, Ian, you've already quoted the sort of 1% of green belt land across the whole of the borough. I don't think we have a figure specifically for Maidenhead's green belt. I'm not sure how you would define Maidenhead's green belt. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ian? Not sure.
Thanks, Ian. I think I responded to a similar question last week. I mean, my view on it is that Maidenhead doesn't have its own green belt as such. The green belt is across the whole borough. In fact, it's actually part of the wider metropolitan green belt. And I think it's almost impossible to be able to, and even if you took the view that Maidenhead did have its own green belt, I don't know how you could logically define what that is. So I think that it doesn't really help us to start to thinking about Maidenhead's green belt, because I think it is a wider concept than that.
Then another question on ecology survey work, and how do we understand what we're set to lose as a result of the development. I think that's been picked up already in terms of the requirement for no or for a net gain in biodiversity, and soon to come in this requirement for 10% net gain in biodiversity. Then a very specific question around the percentage of non-permeable surfaces on the AL14 site. That's not a question we're able to answer this evening, and indeed that there isn't a response to that at the moment, because it will depend upon the more detailed flood risk assessment work that needs to be undertaken under the watchful eye of the Environment Agency. So there isn't a figure for that. Much more detailed work is required before a percentage figure will be known. And then this one's probably coming back to me around, can I promise green corridors rather than saying they're likely to be there? Well, we're at an early stage in the SPD process, but it's certainly something that we will be requiring, because it's in the local plan. I don't know exactly where those green corridors will be running at this stage, or how many there will be, but there is a requirement for those green corridors, and we will certainly be emphasising the importance of connectivity, particularly for wildlife through those corridors. Another question on biodiversity and the calculation of net gain and the dates for when you sort of have your baseline position in comparison to what will be achieved. I think we've probably covered that in general terms already, but can certainly take away the suggestion as to how that author thinks we ought to approach matters.
Ian, should I just come in on
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Actually, I mean, because it is the developers who undertake the assessment of both their sort of baseline position and then what their kind of post-development position is, if you like, on biodiversity, then clearly those assessments would be undertaken and submitted as part of the planning application process. So the timing of those assessments will depend on the timing of when individual planning applications will come in.
Yeah. And then a question on TPOs in terms of looking at protecting the trees that need to be protected rather than just TPOing what is left. It's a little bit more complex than that, in that there will need to be a detailed tree survey undertaken to support any planning applications, and it's standard practice that the proposals that are brought forward as planning applications need to look to preserve the category A trees, and wherever possible category B trees, but as we've discussed already, to accommodate the scale of development that's required, there will need to be some compromises, and that is the planning system weighing up all of the positives and negatives, so meeting future housing needs, delivering community facilities including schools, etc. Areas for recreation need to be weighed up with the loss of trees and impacts on biodiversity, albeit that overall we need to end up with a net gain in biodiversity, and in due course a 10% net gain. Then a question around who will be determining any planning application on the site, and a concern around a conflict of interest between the council as landowner and the financial benefit of any approval that's granted. It will be the Royal Borough that determines the planning application. There is no alternative body to determine an application such as this. And then quite a specific question around alternative sources for heating to be mandated, e.g. ground source heat pumps. Ian Mountselow or James, anything around the use of particular technologies that might be appropriate for South West Maidenhead?
Quite happy to jump in there, Ian. Obviously with new builds, heat pumps work very well, and as we've seen, you know, nationally or internationally at the moment, gas prices are increasing very quickly. So I think developers are going to be very interested in heat pumps regardless of what we define. People are going to want energy efficient homes because it reduces the cost of them running them in the future. So I think heat pumps will play an important role in this, in the heating of the properties. Obviously, the first thing to do is make them as efficient as possible, so you don't have to generate as much heat. But then when generating that heat, yeah, I'm sure heat pumps will play a very important role in the development. We are also looking at doing some work around heat networks as well, and whether they might be appropriate in the setting. But yeah, absolutely, you know, low carbon heating and other generation as well. Obviously, we've spoken about solar panels earlier. They will all play a role in the development.
Sorry everyone, I was talking to myself there. I was muted. I was just apologising to say that we're not going to be able to work our way through all of the questions that have been submitted here and now, but we will, as I said earlier, respond to those that we haven't managed to get to this evening in writing and publish those responses on our website. So I'll now hand back to Ian Motchwell, who has a few words to say by way of closing.
Thanks, Ian. Well, we've got the slides already showing, so if we can maybe move to the next slide, please. Whoever's sharing it. Thank you. Right, so this slide just really explains the next steps in preparing the supplementary planning document. So at the moment we are having the three public sessions. Obviously this is the last one tonight. I hope you found them useful. The next stage will be one or more focused sessions in early May with key technical stakeholders, and these will be then including, for example, national bodies. We'll be inviting Environment Agency, Natural England, Historic England and so on. Then the next stage will be to take all of the information that we've gained, all of the useful knowledge, and start preparing the draft SPD, writing it up. Then that'll be May, June. In late June, we will be taking a report to the Cabinet on a draft consultation version of the SPD, followed by at least 4 weeks, probably 6 weeks likely, consultation on a draft SPD around July and August. And then after that, we'll be obviously considering all of the issues that have been raised in the consultation. Then we'll be updating and amending the SPD as appropriate, and then aiming to finalise and then adopt the SPD in the autumn time. Can't be precise at the moment on exact dates. Partly that will depend on the number of comments that we receive to the consultation and how long it takes to address those. So the SPD itself is produced by the council, but it's very much a partnership approach with not just landowners and promoters, but in consultation with the wider community as well as key stakeholders. So that's really where we are at the moment. And just move to the next slide, please. So just a reminder really that if you'd like to provide further written comments to this consultation, the deadline is the 27th of April, so you've got basically 2 weeks. And there are further details and a response form online, and we also do have hard copies of the material in Maidenhead Library for those that don't have access to the internet. So yeah, so that really is the last session. I hope you found that useful, and I'll now hand back to Councillor Hassler, and just like to thank everyone for attending this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd like to finish by thanking everyone for participating in the 3 public engagement sessions. Your constructive questions, comments and suggestions are valued and incredibly beneficial in shaping the SPD for South West Maidenhead. Again, just to remind you all, you can make your further comments via the online form on the council website up to the 27th of April. So please do let us have your thoughts on all of our matters relating to South West Maidenhead. I'd also like to thank the planning team for their presentations and comprehensively answering the questions, and the communications team for facilitating the meeting. I'm not going to waffle on. I just want to thank you all again very much for participating in these events, and wish you a very good night. Thank you.